Chapter 15 covers risk mitigation. So things we're going to learn in this chapter, we'll look at how to manage risk, some strategies for reducing risk, the practices for mitigating risk, and look at common security issues. A risk can be defined as a situation that involves exposure to some type of danger. We can look at managing risk by creating a level of protection that mitigates the vulnerabilities to the threats and reduces the potential consequences. Now, this involves knowing what threats are being faced, and also assessing those risks. We look at threat assessment, which is a formal process of examining the seriousness of a potential threat as well as the likelihood that it will be carried out. Threats can be further broken down into three different categories: environmental, man-made, or whether it's internal versus external. We can also look at threat categories, whether it's strategic, compliance, financial, operational, technical, or managerial. Strategic threats, there are actions that affect the long-term goals of the organization. The example is the theft of intellectual property, maybe not pursuing a new opportunity, or maybe a new competitor has entered the market. Compliance is following or not following a regulation or a standard. So that could be a breach of contract or not responding to the introduction of new laws. Financial threat is the impact of financial decisions or market factors. So this could be something as simple as the interest rates increasing or a global financial crisis can be a financial threat. Operational threats are events that impact the daily business of the organization, such as a fire, a power blackout, chemical spill. Technical threats, these affect the information technology systems, such as a denial of service attack, SQL injection, a virus. Managerial threats, these are actions related to the management of the organization. This could be a key employee resigning or a long-term illness to a company president, something that's happening to the upper level management that's going to affect how the organization works. Threat assessment, this is something that should be done to determine the asset's value and looks at the relative worth of an asset that is at risk. You also need to do a supply chain assessment. Supply chain is a network that moves product from a supplier to the consumer. This should also be viewed as an asset to the enterprise, the organization, and their threats should be cataloged. Now, this is something that's not always going to be a straightforward exercise when you're assessing the threats. Risk assessment involves testing, change management, privilege management, incident management, risk calculations, and representing risk information. So we look at testing. Testing is technology assets should be tested to identify any vulnerabilities. Now, this involves an automated software vulnerability scan through the system. We have two types of scans. We have intrusive vulnerability scan and non-intrusive vulnerability scan. Intrusive scan attempts to actually penetrate the system to perform a simulated attack. Non-intrusive only uses available information to hypothesize the status of the vulnerability. We also have penetration testing or pen test. This is designed to exploit any weaknesses in the system that are vulnerable, and you should also obtain authorization for penetration testing. The reasons why you should obtain authorization include legal authorization. You want to make sure that you do have the legal rights. You want to make sure that you have a scope of the test so that you fall within that scope of what has been authorized. Change management is a methodology for making modifications and keeping track of change. This is done to ensure that proper documentations of changes are made so that future changes have less chance of creating vulnerability. And this involves all types of changes to the information systems, including changes to the system architecture, or changes to file or document classifications. Everything needs to be documented. So if you make a change, you add a hardware You change hardware, you add new software or change the software, all of that needs to be properly documented. A change management team is the body that is responsible for overseeing the changes. Now, this is something that's going to be composed of representatives from all areas of IT, network security, and also upper management. And any proposed changes, they must first be approved by the change management team. Their duties also include reviewing proposed changes. They want to ensure that risk and the impact of planned changes are understood. They may recommend the approval, disapproval, deferral, or withdrawal of a requested change, and also to communicate the proposed and approved changes to the co-workers. Privilege management. We've talked in the past about the principle of least privilege. Well, privilege management is privilege is defined as the subject's access level over an object, such as the file. Privilege management is a process of assigning or revoking the privileges to the objects. Periodically, you need to go in and review a subject's privileges over an object and conduct a privilege audit. The objective of this is to determine if the subject has the correct privileges. We see an example here of a user access rights review where the access rights will be reviewed on a regular basis by the IT security manager. Incident management. This incident response can be defined as components required to identify, analyze, and contain an incident. Incident handling is the planning, coordination, communications, and planning functions needed to resolve an incident. So we have incident management. That's the framework and functions required to enable incident response and incident handling within an organization. The objective of this is how do we return back to normal operations as quickly as possible with the least impact on business or users. We have to have the management plan set up to allow us to know how to respond to an event and also how to handle an event when it happens. Okay, we have two approaches to risk calculations. You have a quantitative risk calculations. That's usually an educated guess based on observation. And you also have a quantitative risk calculation. This attempts to create hard numbers associated with the risk of an element in the system, and that's using historical data. We also have a risk likelihood. And you got several different tools you can use to predict the likelihood of the risk. You have a mean time between failures, mean time to recovery, mean time to failure, or failure in time. And you can also use historical data, and you can use this to determine the likelihood of a risk occurring within a year. And that's using this is known as the annualized rate of occurrence, or ARO. The example we have here is our sources police department. So in here they can use the crime statistics on the area, and they can determine the probability of vandalism, break-ins, or any other potential dangerous encounters that they may run into. Insurance companies, they can look at the risk factors by other companies and amount paid out when these risks become a reality. The Computer Incident Monitoring Organization, they use data regarding a variety of technology-related risks, failures, and attacks. The risk impact is comparing the monetary loss associated with an asset in order to determine the amount of money it would be lost if the risk occurred. So we have two risk calculation formulas that are used to calculate the expected risk. You have a single loss expectancy. That's how much money you expect to lose every time this risk occurs. And you can also look at an annualized loss expectancy, which is how much money can be lost for an asset due to risk over a 1-year period. Now, when you have this, you can look at two ways to represent risk. You can do a risk register, which lists a potential threat and associated with risk, or a risk matrix, which is a visual color-coded tool It lists the impact and likelihood of the risk. So we'll look at a risk register. As we'll see the risk, the likelihood, the impact, the severity of it, and the mitigation strategies. And we'll also look at a risk matrix where we can see the impact of the risk and the relative likelihood of how the risk happening. We do have some strategies for reducing risk. Some of those approaches include using control types, distributing allocations, and implementing automation. So we use control types, security controls. That's any device or process that's used to reduce the risk. We've got two levels of security controls. You have administrative controls. That's the process for developing and ensuring that policies and procedures are carried out. And you have technical controls. Those are security controls that are carried out or managed by devices. These can also be broken down into subtypes. These can be either technical or administrative. They're deterrent controls, preventive controls, physical controls, detective controls, compensating controls, or corrective controls. Distributive allocation refers to spreading the risk. Now we got a couple ways we can distribute risk, and these include transference, which makes a third party responsible for the risk. We have risk avoidance, and that involves identifying the risk and making the decision to not engage in that activity. Mitigation, that's the attempt to address the risk by making it less serious. Now, a risk is often going to be introduced through human error. So we can use technology as a strategy for reducing the risk, and this can help us minimize these errors. Now, a couple ways we can use technology include automation. We can use images and templates, or non-persistent tools. Now, automation, this can be defined as that which replaces human physical activities. We can use this automation to automate the IT process. Now, this can also provide scalability. That's the ability to continue to function as the size or volume of the enterprise data center expands to meet the growing demands. Elasticity is the ability to revert back to its former size after expanding. And it also gives us the ability to do continuous monitoring. So we have continued surveillance. There are also secure configuration guides that are available to help IT security personnel configure hardware devices and softwares to repel attacks. You may also see vendor-specific guides. Those are useful for configuring web servers, operating systems, applications, network infrastructure devices. You also want to make sure that you have configuration validation, which reviews the configuration of a system to determine if the security settings are correct. So we see an example here of a configuration validation report. As we can see that the first field name is compliant, but we do have one down here with the CV_user_profile_result that is not in compliant. You can also use images and templates. All right, a master image, that's a copy of a previously configured and secured computer software system that can be replicated to other computers. So what this does is eliminates the need for configuring individualized security settings. So we create the image and then we install the image on every device. A template is a type of document which the standardized content is already been created. So in this, the user only needs to enter specialized and variable components. And what it does, it reduces the amount of data to be entered and helps minimize errors that could introduce a risk. Non-persistent tools are used to ensure that unwanted data is not carried forward. So a clean image is used. We'll see some examples here of the different types of tools and how they are used and the description of those tools. A practice for reducing risk. Some of these practices include security policies, awareness and training, agreements, and personnel management. We look at the definition of a policy that communicates a consensus or judgment, defines appropriate behaviors for users, identifies what tools and procedures are needed. It also provides directives for human resource action in response to inappropriate behavior. This is something that may be helpful if it's necessary to prosecute the violators. So we look at what is a security policy. Security policy is a written document that states how an organization plans to protect the company's information technology assets. This is an outline that outlines the protection, and it should be enacted to ensure the organization's assets face minimal risk. This also allows an organization to take appropriate action to safeguard its data. The functions of security policy is that it gives it overall intention and direction, and it's formally expressed by the organization's management. So it details specific risks and how to address them, provides controls to direct employee behavior, helps create security-aware organizational culture. It also helps ensure that employee behavior is directed and monitored in compliance with security requirements. An effective security policy must balance control and trust. We do have three approaches to trust that you can go with. It's trust everyone all the time, trust no one at any time, or trust some people some of the time. So when you're writing a policy or using a security policy, you have to provide the right amount of trust. So you want to trust some of the people some of the time, but you also want to build trust over time. So the level of control must be balanced with your policy. And this is something that's going to be influenced by the security needs and the organization's culture. The way I refer to this is you need to find a balance in your policy between convenience and security. Sometimes you can have too much security that can actually become a security risk because it lowers the convenience factor too low. Now, policies can also be broken down into sub-policies where they break them down into different groups, such as the acceptable encryption policy, an email policy, a wireless communication policy, and so forth. Acceptable use policy. This is a policy that defines the actions the user may perform while accessing the systems. Now, the users are going to include the employees, vendors, contractors, visitors, and this is going to typically cover all computer use, including how mobile devices can be used. It may also have the unacceptable use outlined in this, and this is generally going to be considered the most important information security policy. You may also see some other types of policies, such as the personal email policy, which generally covers how a company email, use a company email to send personal email messages, accessing personal emails at your place of employment, or forwarding company emails to a personal account. You may see a social media policy that determines whether or not you can use social media at work and what risks are involved in that. So the social media policy may outline acceptable employee use of social media. There may be reasons for setting a social media policy, setting standards for the employees to use, defining limitations, protecting the enterprise's reputations, and also creating consistency across the channels. A key defense in information security is training. So you want to provide security awareness and training to the users. This is sometimes called continuing education. All users will need continuous education, continuous training, and new security defenses, and also to be reminded of company security policies and procedures. Now, there are a couple opportunities for security training. Some of the most common ones include when a new employee is hired, after a computer attack has occurred, when an employee is promoted, maybe it's during an annual department retreat, or when new user software is installed or new hardware is upgraded. These two charts, this shows the traits and the number of population for people born in those years. This is showing the different way people learn and different approaches to different types of training approaches. Now, different training styles, they've got different learning styles as well, whether it's visual, audio, or actually doing the task. So training styles that'll impact how people learn include role-based training. So that involves specialized training that is customized to a specific role that an employee holds in the organization. We also have agreements. So we do have some risks of third-party integration, include onboarding and offboarding. So bringing a new company on, taking it, the company leaving, third-party leaving, application, social media network sharing, privacy and risk awareness, and also data considerations. So we have interoperability agreements. These are formal contractual relationships that as they're related to security policy and procedures. This is part of the standard operating procedures, which are the actions that are conducted, and conduct that are considered normal. So we see some different types of agreement that you may have with your organization. These are something that needs to be reviewed periodically to make sure that they are in compliance. Personnel management. Okay, when you're hiring someone, a background check should be conducted. That's the process of authenticating the information supplied on a potential employer to a potential employer by a job applicant in the resume, application, and interview. Also, when an employee leaves, an exit interview is usually conducted. It's kind of a wrap-up meeting between the management representatives and the person leaving the organization. Security professionals should have the knowledge and skill to troubleshoot the common security issues listed below. And these issues as well. So in this chapter, we went over what a risk is. We looked at some different ways to calculate risk, and there are several ways to reduce the risk. We've also looked at a securities policy and how it's broken down, and different parties, how different parties can reach an understanding to work together in their interoperability agreements.